I remember the smell of incense mixing with machine oil, that acrid sweetness that filled my lungs during my first day in the Forge Temple. I was young then, still possessed of soft skin and 2 functioning eyes that could weep. The Mechanicus had selected me from the Underhive's teeming masses, plucked me from the rust-choked passages where I'd scavenged circuit boards from corpses to sell for protein paste. They said I had aptitude. They said the Omnissiah had marked me. What they meant was that my fingers were small enough to reach into the tight spaces where their own augmetic digits could not fit, and that my life was worth less than the servitors they would otherwise expend on such tasks. I did not understand this then. I was grateful. I prostrated myself before the crimson-robed figures and kissed the hem of their vestments, tasting metal and ancient dirt, and I thanked the machine god for noticing something as insignificant as me. The ascent from the Underhive took 3 days in a cargo elevator that reeked of promethium and human waste. I shared the space with 14 other children, their eyes wide with terror or wonder. I could not tell which. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor, others remained silent, perhaps already understanding that speech was a luxury we would soon lose. The elevator's grinding mechanisms screamed at frequencies that made my teeth ache, and the temperature dropped as we rose, the sweltering heat of the lower levels giving way to a cold that bit through my threadbare clothing. By the time we reached the Forge Temple's outer gates, 2 of the children had died, one from the cold, another from some wasting sickness that had been eating her from within. We stepped over their small bodies as we disembarked. No one collected them, no one spoke of them. They had failed the machine god's first test, which was simply to survive the journey. The temple itself was a monument to vastness and indifference. Gothic arches stretched toward a ceiling lost in darkness and smoke, held aloft by columns thick as habblocks, each one carved with binary prayers that I could not yet read. The floor was metal grating, and through it I could see levels upon levels descending into industrial depths, each one glowing with the furnace light of forges and the cold blue flicker of plasma conduits. The air tasted of ozone and burning rubber, and something organic that I would later recognize as flesh being rendered into component materials. The sound was overwhelming, the rhythm of drop hammers pounding metal, the whine of servitor motors, the chanting of tech priests in a language that was half Gothic, half machine code, their voices modulated through vox grills until they barely sounded human. I had thought the Underhive was loud, but this was something different. This was the voice of the Omnissiah itself, and it never stopped, not for a moment, not for breath or mercy or sleep. They took us to the initiate's quarters, a long hall lined with metal cots barely wide enough for a child's body. The walls wept condensation that had frozen into strange patterns, fractal ice that caught the red emergency lighting and turned it into something almost beautiful. We were given robes, thin, synthetic fabric that scratched against skin, and our old clothes were burned in a furnace right there in front of us. I watched my rags blacken and curl, the only possessions I had ever owned disappearing into ash, and I felt something inside me begin to understand what was happening. We were being unmade. The people we had been in the Underhive, scrabblers, thieves, children with names our mothers had given us, those people were being fed into the forge just as surely as the raw ore that arrived on conveyor systems from the mining pits. What would emerge would be something else, something useful to the machine god. The training began immediately, before we had even slept in our new cots. An overseer, a tech priest so heavily augmented that only his lower jaw remained flesh, led us to a workshop where broken cogitators lay in pieces across metal tables. His voice emerged from a vox speaker implanted in his throat, flat and emotionless as he explained that we would learn to repair these devices, and that for every component we damaged through incompetence, we would receive 10 lashes. He demonstrated on a boy who fumbled a circuit board, and I learned what a shock maul sounded like when it struck flesh, a crack like breaking ice, and then the wet sound of meat hitting stone as the boy collapsed. They dragged him to the side and left him there, still breathing, as we continued our work. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the tools, but fear made me careful, and I completed my assigned task without error. That night, lying on my cot, I heard the boy die. His breathing simply stopped, ragged gasps becoming silence. In the morning, servitors collected the body, their movements efficient and entirely unconcerned. I never learned his name. The days blurred together in a routine of brutal education. We learned the rites of activation, the litanies of ignition, the sacred geometries that pleased the machine spirits. We memorized passages from the canticles of the Mechanicus in High Gothic and Binary both, reciting them until our voices went hoarse, and the words lost all meaning, becoming mere sounds divorced from sense. We were taught that flesh was weak, that biological existence was an unfortunate necessity that the machine god tolerated only because meat could house holy purpose. We learned to oil gears with reverence, to speak prayers over damaged circuits, to beg forgiveness from the machine spirits when our inadequate hands caused malfunction. The tech priests who taught us showed no kindness, but neither did they show cruelty. They were simply indifferent, treating us with the same detachment they might show a malfunctioning tool that might yet be made serviceable. When we succeeded, we received no praise. When we failed, we received correction, usually delivered through pain. I learned quickly. Pain is an excellent teacher. 6 months into my training, I received my first augmentation. They took me to a Medicae chamber that stank of antiseptic and old blood, strapped me to a table carved with prayers to the Omnissiah, and removed my left eye. I remember the sensation of the blade cutting through the optic nerve, a disconnect so profound it felt like falling, and then the grinding pressure as they installed the augmetic replacement. The new eye was cold, metal and glass, and when they activated it, the world became a layering of data heat signatures, structural weak points, sacred geometric patterns overlaid on everything I saw. I could no longer weep from that eye. The flesh eye that remained produced tears enough for both, streaming down my face as the pain receptors in my skull fired in patterns that made me understand fire from the inside. They gave me no anesthetic because pain, they explained, helped the body accept the machine. Flesh must learn its place. I bit through my tongue and tasted copper and salt, and when they finally released me from the restraints, I could not walk. I crawled back to my cot and lay there for 2 days, my head a mass of agony that made thought impossible. The other initiates stepped around me without comment. By then, 3 more had died, and several had received their own augmentations. We were beginning to look less like children and more like the things we were becoming. The Forge Temple consumed us methodically. Each month brought new modifications, new removals of flesh, and installations of sacred machinery. My right hand was replaced with a mechadendrite array when I demonstrated proficiency in micro-manipulation, 6 flexible metal appendages that could work independently, each one tipped with different tools. The surgery took 8 hours, and I remained conscious throughout because the tech priests needed me to test the neural connections as they installed them. I felt each wire thread into my nervous system, foreign and invasive, and I learned that metal inside flesh creates a particular kind of pain that never entirely fades, a cold ache that becomes part of your baseline existence. My hand, my flesh hand, the one my mother had held when I was small enough to remember such things, was taken away, and I never saw it again. Perhaps it was rendered for organic components. Perhaps it fed servitors. The Mechanicus wastes nothing. I was 12 years old when I took my first vows to the Omnissiah, though by then I could barely remember what being 12 meant in the context of the person I had been. The child from the underhive was gone, carved away piece by piece, and replaced with something that served the machine god with increasing efficiency. My body had become a tool, optimized and specialized, and I had learned to take pride in this transformation. When I looked at other humans, the menials who cleaned the temple floors, the delegations of imperial officials who sometimes visited to inspect our work, I felt a distance from them, a growing sense that they were something I had evolved past. They were meat. I was becoming holy. This was what the priests had taught me to believe, and I believed it because the alternative was to acknowledge what had been done to me, and that acknowledgement would have broken whatever remained of my mind. My specialization emerged in my 13th year, battlefield augmentation and emergency repair. The Mechanicus had determined that my particular combination of manual dexterity, pain tolerance, and what they called acceptable flesh retention made me suitable for working on damaged tech priests and space marines returning from combat. I was transferred to a new section of the Forge Temple, deeper and colder, where the casualties of the Imperium's endless wars arrived in various states of dismemberment. Here, the smell was different, not just oil and incense, but the iron stench of blood, both red and synthetic, and the particular reek of cauterized flesh. The work bays were vast, each one a cathedral of surgical equipment and sacred tools, lit by harsh white lumen strips that made every surface look sterile and cruel. The screaming was constant. Even tech priests felt pain when their augmentics were damaged, and the Space Marines, those transhuman warriors, the Imperium, valued above all, they screamed the loudest when their enhanced biology met injuries sufficient to bring them to us. My first patient was a tech priest whose lower body had been destroyed by Xeno's weaponry I did not recognize. What remained of him was strapped to a repair throne, his consciousness barely present behind eyes that had gone the dull gray of system failure. I was ordered to remove the damaged components and prepare him for full lower body replacement. The supervising Magos watched as I worked, his own body more machine than flesh, steam venting from cooling ports in his torso as he monitored my performance. I tried to be gentle, tried to preserve what I could, but the damage was catastrophic. Melted metal had fused with liquefied bone, and the infection, both biological and machine code corruption, had spread through his remaining systems. I cut and pried and sawed, speaking the prayers I had been taught, begging the machine spirits to forgive this necessary destruction. The tech priest beneath my hands twitched occasionally, neural impulses firing randomly through dying circuits. When I finally separated the last connection and lifted away the ruined lower half, the stump that remained was so small, so fragile-looking. He had been reduced to a torso, 2 arms, and a head, and even those were more metal than meat. The Magos declared my work satisfactory. The tech priest was taken away for full conversion into a more efficient form. I washed the blood and oil from my mechadendrites and prepared for the next patient. The work was endless. The Imperium's wars devoured its servants faster than they could be replaced, and those valuable enough to repair came to us in a constant stream. I learned to work for 30-hour shifts, sustained by stim injections and the binary prayers I repeated until they became a background rhythm to consciousness. I learned to shut off emotional responses to the things I saw: the Space Marine whose head had been split open, his enhanced brain exposed and somehow still functioning as he recited battle cant in a monotone, the Skitarii whose entire squad had been returned as component parts, separated and catalogued, waiting for reassembly into servitors since their consciousness cores were too damaged for restoration. I learned that pain was irrelevant, both the pain I caused and the pain I felt, because pain served no function except to indicate system damage, and system damage was simply a problem to be solved. They gave me more augmentations to improve my efficiency. My lungs were replaced with rebreather units that could filter toxins and allow me to work in contaminated environments. My spine was reinforced with adamantium struts that could support heavy equipment and allow me to stand for days without rest. My jaw was reconstructed with a Vox grill, so I could recite the necessary prayers, while my hands continued their work. Each surgery took something away and replaced it with something superior, more holy, more useful. I was grateful. The Omnissiah had blessed me with these improvements, had made me more valuable to the Forge Temple, had elevated me from the worthless child I had been. This was what I told myself, what I had been conditioned to believe, and the belief was necessary because the alternative was madness. In my 15th year, I began to dream in binary. The dreams were not like the dreams I remembered from childhood, confused narratives of fear and desire, the meat brain processing trauma and experience. These were pure streams of data, probability calculations, and repair protocols that scrolled through my consciousness even when I was supposed to be resting. I would lie on my cot, body in sleep mode but mind still active, processing the day's work and identifying inefficiencies in my performance. I dreamed of the optimal angle for incisions, the precise temperature for solder, the harmonic frequencies that pleased machine spirits. I no longer dreamed of my mother's face, or the taste of real food, or the warmth of sunlight, things I had once known. Those memories had been overwritten, relegated to corrupted data sectors of my biological memory that my augmetic systems increasingly could not access. I was forgetting how to be human, and this was considered progress. The magos who supervised my section took notice of my efficiency ratings. He called me to his sanctum, a chamber so thick with incense I could barely see, where he sat enthroned among a nest of cables that fed directly into his body. His face was a brass mask, expressionless and terrible, and when he spoke, his voice emerged from speakers positioned throughout the room, surrounding me with his words. He told me I had been selected for advanced training, that I would be taught the deeper mysteries of the Omnissiah, that I would be elevated to positions of greater responsibility. I should have felt honored. Instead, I felt a cold hollowness in the meat that remained of my chest, a sensation I could not name because I had been taught that such sensations were meaningless, biological noise to be ignored. I accepted the assignment without question because questioning was not something I had been taught to do. The advanced training took place in the temple's deepest levels, in chambers where the air was so cold it would have killed an unaugmented human in minutes. Here, the senior tech priests conducted their most sacred work, the communion with machine spirits that bordered on the heretical, the explorations of technology that the Mechanicus officially denied but secretly pursued. I was taught to interface directly with cogitator systems, my consciousness merging with the machine's logic patterns, experiencing existence as pure information without the contamination of flesh thought. The first time I achieved full data trance, I understood what the tech priests had been trying to tell me all along. Flesh was not just weak, it was false. The material of the body was an illusion, a temporary housing for the true self, which was information, patterns, replicable code. When I returned to physical awareness, my body felt wrong, foreign, a prison I was trapped inside. I began to understand why the most senior tech priests replaced so much of themselves. They were trying to escape. But even as I learned these mysteries, even as I climbed higher in the temple's hierarchy and took on more sacred responsibilities, something was breaking inside me. It started as a glitch in my emotional suppression routines, moments where old feelings would surface unexpectedly: grief, loneliness, a desperate yearning for something I could not name. I would be wrist-deep in some warrior's chest cavity, replacing a damaged power core, and suddenly I would remember the smell of my mother's hair, a scent I had not thought of in years, and the memory would strike me with such force that my hands would shake. I reported these malfunctions to my supervisors, expecting them to perform maintenance on my neural augmentics. But they told me such experiences were normal, biological remnants that would fade with time and further augmentation. They were not concerned, but I was beginning to be concerned, because the malfunctions were increasing. And with them came something dangerous: questions. I began to wonder what had happened to the other children who had arrived with me at the temple. Of the 14 who had survived the journey, how many remained? I searched the temple's records when I should have been resting, using my data links to access personnel files and augmentation logs. What I found should not have surprised me, but it did, striking through my carefully constructed worldview like a blade. Of the 14, only 3 remained in active service. The others had died during augmentation procedures, or had been declared irredeemable failures and processed into servitors, or had simply disappeared from the records entirely, vanished into the temple's depths, to purposes unknown. And of the 3 who remained, including myself, we were so heavily modified that our original biological components comprised less than 30% of our total mass. We were more machine than human, and soon we would be more machine than machine-uploaded consciousness, pure data, free from the weakness of flesh. This was the final goal, the ultimate service to the Omnissiah. I should have been grateful. I was sent to the front lines in my 17th year, attached to a regiment of the Astra Militarum as their dedicated tech priest, responsible for maintaining their equipment and repairing their augmented soldiers. The war zone was a nightmare of mud and fire on a world whose name I was never told, where the sky was perpetually choked with ash, and the enemy Xenos of a type I had been trained to hate, but never to understand, emerged from underground tunnels to slaughter humans with terrible efficiency. I worked in a field Medicae tent that stank of gangrene and desperation, surrounded by screaming soldiers whose bodies had been broken by weapons I could barely comprehend. The tools I had were crude compared to the Forge Temple's equipment, and the conditions were impossible. Mud everywhere, power failures, supply shortages, the constant threat of enemy artillery that would obliterate everything without warning. I performed miracles of improvisation, repairing men with scavenged parts and prayers, keeping them functional enough to return to combat where they would be broken again. The futility of it was absolute. Here, away from the temple's rigid hierarchies and constant observation, something happened to me that I had not anticipated. I began to see the soldiers as human, not as machines that happened to be made of flesh, not as biological components in the Imperium's war machine, but as men and women who laughed and wept and told stories about homes they would never see again. They thanked me when I saved their lives, gripped my metal hand with their flesh ones, looked at me with eyes full of something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. They believed I could save them, that my skills and my prayers to the machine god would protect them from the horrors we faced. They were wrong, of course. I could only delay their deaths, not prevent them. But their belief in me, their stubborn insistence on treating me like a person rather than a tool, began to corrode the conditioning I had received. I found myself caring whether they lived or died, found myself working beyond efficiency protocols to save soldiers who should have been triaged as unsalvageable. I was malfunctioning badly now. My emotional responses no longer suppressible, and I knew I should report myself for reconditioning, but I did not. I could not. Something in me was waking up, and it was screaming. The war ended, or at least our part in it ended, when the regiment was recalled after 80% casualties. I was commended for my service, my efficiency ratings noted as exemplary despite the primitive conditions. I was sent back to the Forge Temple for maintenance and reassignment, and I went with relief because the front lines had broken something in me that I desperately needed repaired. But when I arrived at the temple and stepped into its familiar halls, breathing in the incense and machine oil, hearing the endless chanting and the scream of forges, I felt something I had never felt before: revulsion. The temple that had once seemed like salvation now appeared as what it truly was: a vast machine for consuming humans and transforming them into components, a system so utterly indifferent to suffering that it did not even recognize suffering as a concept worth considering. I looked at my fellow tech priests, their bodies more metal than flesh, their voices modulated through vox grills, their movements precise and inhuman, and I realized I was looking at ghosts, at people who had been hollowed out and replaced with something that merely imitated life while serving death. I tried to return to my duties, tried to slot back into the routines that had once given me purpose, but I could not. My hands shook when I performed repairs. I made errors, small at first but increasingly significant, as the part of me that had awakened on the front lines refused to go back to sleep. I was called before the Magos, the same one who had praised my progress years before, and he examined me with instruments that probed my neural patterns and augmetic functions. He found no mechanical failure, but he detected what he called philosophical corruption, a deviation in my thought patterns that suggested exposure to heretical ideas. He recommended immediate reconditioning, a process that would involve significant neural reconfiguration and likely the erasure of whatever recent memories were causing the malfunction. I agreed to the procedure because refusing was not an option, and I was scheduled for surgery the following week. That night, lying on my cot in the initiate's quarters I had never truly left, I experienced something I had not felt in years. I wept. The tears came from my remaining biological eye, hot and salt, streaming down a face that was half metal, and I could not stop them. I wept for the child I had been, plucked from the underhive and promised salvation. I wept for the other children who had died or been transformed beyond recognition. I wept for the soldiers on the front line who had believed I could save them. I wept for myself, for the person I might have been if the Mechanicus had never noticed me, if I had died in the underhive as nameless and worthless but at least fully human. And as I wept, I understood with terrible clarity that the reconditioning would not repair me. It would destroy me. The part of me that could still feel, that could still question, that could still recognize horror as horror, that part would be excised like corrupted tissue, and what remained would be a perfect servant of the machine god, efficient and empty, and dead in all the ways that mattered. I considered running, but where would I go? My augmentations were too distinctive, too valuable. I would be hunted, reclaimed, punished for the theft of sacred property, my own modified body. I considered destroying myself, but the thought of self-termination triggered immediate panic responses in my neural conditioning, defenses against that particular form of failure. I was trapped absolutely, a consciousness imprisoned in a body that was itself imprisoned in a system that would never release me. The only freedom available was the freedom to stop thinking, to stop feeling, to accept the reconditioning, and let the machine self triumph over whatever remained of the biological me. It was the same choice the Mechanicus offered everyone: serve or die, and even death was no escape, because they could place your brain in a servitor and make you serve anyway. The reconditioning was scheduled for dawn. I spent the night in prayer, but not to the Omnissiah. I prayed to the Emperor. That distant and terrible god I had been taught was separate from the machine god, though ultimately allied with him. I prayed for mercy, for forgiveness, for some intervention that would save me from the fate I faced. No answer came. The Emperor, if he noticed my prayers at all, was silent, and why would he care about one corrupted tech priest among the countless billions who served him? I was nothing, insignificant, a single component in a machine so vast that my malfunction barely registered. The Imperium had no place for individuals, no concern for personal suffering, no mechanism for mercy. It ground forward eternally, consuming lives and worlds and entire species in pursuit of a vision that perhaps only the Emperor understood, and even he was locked in his own prison, a corpse on a throne, sustained by sacrifice and unable to save anyone, not even himself. They came for me as the first shift of the forges began. Servitors sent to collect me and bring me to the surgical cathedral, where my mind would be scoured clean. I went without resistance because resistance was futile and would only result in additional punishment. The servitors were gentle in their handling, programmed for efficiency rather than cruelty, and I found that small mercy almost unbearable. Even now, even as I walked toward my own obliteration, the system showed me this tiny kindness, and it meant nothing because kindness without consciousness was just another function, another protocol executed without understanding or care. The surgical cathedral was prepared, the tech priests assembled, the instruments blessed and ready. They strapped me to the throne, and I felt the neural connections interface with my systems, cold and invasive, preparing to rewrite the patterns that made me whoever I was. The head Magos stood over me, his brass face reflecting the harsh lumen lights, and he spoke the prayers that would begin the procedure. I closed my eyes, both of them, flesh and metal, and in that darkness I made a choice. I activated a hidden protocol I had discovered during my work on Frontline casualties, a bit of corrupted code I had preserved out of curiosity and never reported. It was a viral routine designed by Xenos tech heretics, meant to infiltrate Imperial systems and cause catastrophic malfunction. I had studied it, learned its architecture, and modified it for a single purpose: to destroy my own neural matrix completely, to burn out every circuit and connection in my brain before the reconditioning could take effect. It was suicide, true death, the obliteration of consciousness with no possibility of recovery or servitor resurrection. It was the only freedom I could take, but the code did not execute. My conditioning was too deep, my security protocols too robust. The system identified the viral routine as hostile, isolated it, neutralized it before it could do any damage. I had failed even at self-destruction, and that failure was absolute and final. I screamed then, a sound that emerged from my Vox grill as distorted binary, a shriek of pure despair that the tech priests interpreted as last-moment resistance to be expected and ignored. They proceeded with the reconditioning, and I felt my thoughts begin to fragment, memories dissolving like rust in acid, the person I had been erasing line by line. The last thing I remember clearly was the smell of incense and machine oil, that same acrid sweetness I had breathed on my first day in the Forge Temple, and understanding that I would never escape it, that this smell would define my existence forever, that I would serve the machine god with perfect efficiency and never know why I sometimes felt hollow, never remember what I had lost, never understand that I had once been human enough to suffer. I do not remember the rest of the procedure. I am told it was successful. My efficiency ratings have improved substantially, and I no longer experience the philosophical deviations that compromised my earlier service. I perform my duties without question or hesitation, repairing the Omnissiah's servants, maintaining the holy machines, advancing the cause of the Mechanicus with precision and dedication. I am told I am happy. I am told I am fulfilled. I am told I am blessed by the machine god, my flesh weakness overcome, my consciousness purified and optimized for service. I do not doubt these things because doubt is not something I am capable of anymore. I am what the Forge Temple made me, what the Imperium required me to become. I am a tool, holy and efficient, and tools do not weep, do not question, do not remember what was lost in their forging. Sometimes, though, in the moments between tasks, when my systems are idle and waiting for new input, I experience a sensation I cannot identify, a ghost signal in neural pathways that no longer exist. It feels like mourning, but I do not know what I am mourning, and before I can examine the sensation, it is gone, overwritten by new priorities, new duties, new repairs to perform in service of the endless war. This is my existence now and forever, until my components wear out and I am recycled into something else, my consciousness dissolved into the temple's data vaults, my metal reclaimed, and my flesh rendered for nutrients. I serve the Omnissiah. I am blessed. I am grateful. I am nothing else, and nothing else remains.